Adam, so great to have you in the podcast. How are you today?
Good, Jared. I'm doing well and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah, I'm pumped. This is we're recording this on a Friday. This was the highlight of my day. I was really excited to chat with you and just want to have a cool, casual conversation. So, why don't we kick it off? For those in our audience that are just getting to know you for the first time, tell them a little about Adam and is it EcoTech or EcoTech? EcoTech? Am I saying it right?
Yep.
Perfect. And then give us a quick overview of EcoTech Capital.
Sure. So my background, I've been an investment banker for 30 years. Almost all that time I've worked with high growth companies. I started working in the healthcare internet sector, then internet and tech, and then fell into solar. And really over the last 20 years, I've worked at the intersection of tech innovation and climate change, but really with high growth companies who are doing really interesting things to really go into sectors that have not changed for generations and bring new technology to drive efficiency. So for me, I like to work with companies that have technology where they can come in and really make a change. And EcoTech Capital is a boutique investment bank, and we really work with clients to help them think through how they grow and scale their business, how they capitalize their business, how they raise money, how they find strategic partners to drive revenue and profitability. And ultimately, and really most importantly for a lot of these industries, food and ag in particular, is how they get exits. One of the biggest challenges I think out there today is we see a lot of capital has been raised, about $40 billion since about 2018 globally, with very few exits. And so the big question comes, it's a real dynamic and exciting sector, but how do investors make money? And I think that's the conundrum people are facing right now, where you have technology, but you don't have exits. And that's one of the things we've got to figure out if we want to ensure this sector is going to be successful. And I look at it and say, we don't really have a choice. Food is not a luxury. It's something we all need, and we've got to figure it out because growing it is getting more challenging and more expensive every year.
There's several reasons I wanted to chat with you, but one of the top reasons was definitely because you've worked across several capital intensive sectors and you've seen bubbles, you've seen these spaces evolve. Let's talk a little bit about maybe how ag tech companies should be thinking differently than some of those other industries. And you can mention some of those industries, but like, what should they be doing differently? What are some of the biggest lessons they can learn from like EV, solar, wind, biofuels, those spaces, so they don't repeat some of the same missteps that those spaces did?
I think that's in many regards the most important question, because we went through a period from about 2017, 2018 through 2022 where I often joke capital was free, that people kind of drove up. It was almost like an ATM. They said, here, we're raising money for this. And people are like, oh, that's really cool. Here's money. And that's, I often argue, the worst situation, because free money doesn't force companies to actually build businesses rapidly and get to profitability. It allows them to really think broadly and strategically of all the things they can do. But for a startup, you need to be laser focused. You need to think about, I have X amount of capital. How am I going to achieve what I need to do with this money? And what happens if I don't get much more money? How am I going to build a viable business? And really, we went through a period where that's not where a lot of founders were thinking. They were thinking, and because their investors were giving them lots of money at high valuations, they were thinking, how do I build the next unicorn? Let's be very clear. In the sectors I've worked to date, whether it's solar and wind and biofuels, EVs, energy storage, there aren't a lot of unicorns. Everyone always likes to point to Tesla. Tesla's great, fantastic. I often say to people, if you look at solar, we had some good companies. First Solar was a good company. SunPower was a good company. There were a couple Chinese companies that got to scale, but they weren't really hugely profitable companies. One of the things that's really important when you look at these industries, and I often say to entrepreneurs, and I say to investors as well, is keep in mind, in many regards, these aren't tech companies. These are industrial agriculture companies. These are industrial food companies. We throw the word tech on, and typically when we throw tech on, everyone just thinks software. Software, 70% gross profit margins, 40, 50% EBITDA margins, you roll in money. Let's be very clear. There are very few companies in ag tech that are going to get margins like that. You're talking about companies that are going into sectors that have been around for generations, or in the case of ag, more than a thousand years. And they usually have some oligopolies in charge, and those oligopolies have lots of capital, they have name recognition, maybe as importantly, they have distribution, and they fight new entrants. And if an incumbent is doing well, in the case of people like Darren Corteva, they could get 40% gross profit and 25 to 30% EBITDA in their best years. That's a great company, but you know what it's not? It's not a tech company. And so I think there's been unrealistic expectations of what a lot of these companies can achieve. And if we took a step back and said, okay, let's think of them as they are going to outperform the incumbents by maybe 5% better margins. So rather than a 10% EBITDA margin, maybe they can get to 15, maybe they can even get to 20. And we use that as an expectation rather than a lot of the business plans I've seen over the past decade where all of a sudden companies get to 40% EBITDA margins. It's just not likely. So I think the best thing that we can teach entrepreneurs is focus on what's actually achievable. Use your capital wisely and take the time. I know companies think they need to speed ahead. These aren't industries that speed ahead. If you go in with a technology that doesn't work to a farm, there's a high likelihood you will never get back on that farm again if it doesn't work. I think there's an assumption sometimes that tech all works the same. Like we get iPhones. Let's be very clear. The first iPhone wasn't great. Even today's iPhone needs software updates. There's always issue. It's a consumer electronic. We're used to it. Very different than if you have a piece of equipment on a farm that someone paid a fair amount of money and it doesn't work. Do you know what happens to that? It sits on the side of the farm and doesn't get used. And that doesn't help anyone. So I really think a lot of the challenges we faced are a lot of people have tried to run before they could walk.
I mean, I think there's blame that can be spread out across a couple different parties, but I know from like the founder perspective, there is a pressure to, just like when you see all these decks, right, with AI everywhere in it now, because founders know that if it doesn't have, it's not even that you put that in that you get funding. If you don't have it, it's almost a concern, right, from the investor looking at the deck. But I always wish that, and specifically also for this space, you have 2 slides at the end of every deck when you're raising. Here's what we use the proceeds for, and here's how this would. Here's if we didn't have money, what we would do. I just think it's an exercise that every founder should go through and every investor should ask for, because there's really no wrong answer, right? It's just to see it's kind of like those teaser questions you used to get, the brain teaser questions in interviews, right? Just to see what they say. What are your thoughts on that? I would love to see that more, though.
It's funny. I was having that conversation this past week with one of my clients and said they want to go out and raise all this money. I said, okay, so walk me through what happens if you don't raise it or you raise half that amount of money. What can you do as a business? Because realistically, you can still do a lot. You might just not be able to do everything you're expecting over a short amount of time. I actually think for most startups that are looking in the ag sector, they should be looking at about a decade. That's what it's going to take for development. And those who probably are assuming it's going to be much quicker than that have unrealistic assumptions on both how much capital they're going to be able to raise and how quickly they're going to get market penetration. That's the thing I think people don't fully grasp. Agriculture is a sector that even if a farmer says, you know what, we want to use your product, if they've got 1,000 acres, they're not putting it on 1,000 acres year one. They're probably putting it on 10 acres, and maybe second year they'll get 20 or 30, and then maybe get 50, and then maybe you get 100. And if it works on that 100, maybe year 5 you get on all of it. Very rarely has a product come on where a grower says, you know what, gotta have that, gotta put it on, let's get it on today. Farmers are risk adverse because they understand if the technology doesn't work, it's going to have a significant negative financial impact on them. And their priority is to make money. I always say to people, farmers aren't against technology. My in-laws were dairy farmers. I used to have this conversation with my father-in-law. They're not against it. They're against what they deem to be risky technology. If you show up with products, and I have a couple clients who are doing this, one in the regen ag sector, another in kind of precision digital ag, with a very clear show of how you are going to get an ROI in year one, people like that. They're willing to take that and say, okay, you've done it with my neighbors, you're showing here's the data, here's what we're going to do, and it's very clear. That's a good recipe for being able to get on a farm. I say to people all the time, if you can show a farmer an ROI less than a year, they're likely going to look at it very seriously. Again, they're not going to put it on all 1,000 acres, but they're going to put it on and test it out because they want to make more money.
You're speaking, yeah. You're hitting those heartstrings right there. That's what they want.
Yeah.
It, Adam, as you look at the space, what if you had to break just agriculture, ag tech into several different like buckets that you're particularly like bullish on, excited about the most? Um, what do those look like?
Yeah. So it's probably not going to come as a surprise, Jared, based on what I just said, which is it's going to be stuff that provides a real-time ROI. So the areas I'm most bullish on right now are robotics and automation and digitization, and particularly if you can actually combine the two. I look right now and see all the challenges that the agriculture sector faces. And I spend a lot of my time, because I live in San Francisco, looking at California, and especially in the permanent side, and knowing all of the issues that those farmers face. And they're huge. And it's labor cost, it's labor availability, it's water costs and water availability, it's regulation, it's change in weather and weather volatility. It is not easy to be a farmer today, and I often joke the one thing a farmer doesn't do is wake up on January 1st, pull out the farmer's almanac and say, oh, here's what the weather's going to be like this year. Because I think it's pretty clear that it's just changing, and so they don't know. And so the question really comes down to how do they think about success for the future? And really, to me, the robotics and automation, and again, I think really back to what I said before, that's really important. I think you need to develop robotics and automation for today. I think one of the issues that a lot of companies are facing is they're developing some incredible technology, but it's really, really expensive. And candidly, I'm not sure it's even needed today. It's almost like they're developing stuff for 2035. And the problem is the cost is so expensive that it doesn't make sense. And that piece of equipment in 2035, when the grower will want to buy it, is probably going to be 50% less because the technology will have advanced and semiconductor prices, all these things you'd expect are going to happen. And so I look at what is needed today, what can the farmer optimize, and then the other thing I go back to, particularly on the digital side, I often say to people is, I'm a huge fan of farmers. But one of the things that they're challenged by is lack of information, and really very clear information. And what I often say is, today, I think of a farm as what I looked and did some industrial work 20 plus years ago. And we go into these factories, and these factories were old, and they were manual, and they were dirty, and they didn't have a lot of technology. But you'd go over to the manager who's running it, and you'd say, how does it run? And he goes, it's great. We're at 97% efficiency. So how did he measure that? Well, they looked at what their best quarter ever was or best month was, and they're doing 97% of that. But that doesn't mean that factory is at 97%. That just means the best they've run it. What's interesting is if you took that factory today, and that factory built today would have robotics and automation, AI, IoT, machine learning, a lot of robots and technology, not as many humans, and you asked him how it was running, he'd still say, oh, it's going at 97%. The difference is it would be 120% of the old facility because they've actually now have the data to optimize it because they know where all their issues are and have fixed it. That's what we're about to see on the farm. I do some work with some really interesting players on the specialty side who are actually using this data, and they were showing me details of where they go and can see crop by crop what's happening. They can see real-time dead zones. They can go and say, are we getting enough fertigation here? Are we getting enough water here? How do we optimize it? We're losing plants on this side, but not on this side. Why is it different? We're the biggest limitation to agriculture, in my mind, over the next 5 years is going to be the willingness of farmers to use and actually believe the data. And I think that's one of the challenges out there is that a lot of growers think we're doing a great job. We've been doing it for a long time. My father, his father have been doing it for generations. We know how to farm this land. But you know what? The data is going to come back and probably say something different. And it's going to be interesting to see. To me, the successful growers are going to be the ones who take that data and actually use it to their benefit. And the others, who I kind of refer to as the ostriches, who put their heads in the ground, are probably going to suffer.
I mean, do you think we're gonna just see some changes though, just because of the fact that we have like a new generation? Like, I read something, I forget where it was, and it could be completely wrong, but I want to say it and see if you either agree or it was right. It was something like a lot of families that were farming,
Yeah.
it like skipped a generation, and they think the grandkids are gonna end up doing more of it. Like, I have no idea if that's true or not, but I thought I read that somewhere. And I'm just wondering if that is to happen.
Yeah.
I can only imagine that a generation that grew up with technology from the time they were in like sixth, seventh grade is going to want to look at some of these technologies even more so than their parents and grandparents.
I haven't heard it skipping a generation, but I'm not going to say that's not correct because I've
Yeah.
heard the younger generations just generally are much more excited by. I was surprised to learn this. Someone was telling me about the going back to rural areas and going back into agriculture. I think it's a fair statement to say yes, they'll be more apt to use technology, but I wouldn't say they're going to be using it in the same way they use technology in the rest of their lives initially, because they're probably going to go out on the field with their grandfather who is still going to influence what they do. They'll probably say, Grandpa, like, we need to update this and use more technology. But at the same time, they're probably not going to go all in initially. I'll tell you what I do think is going to be a bigger driver. I think people's comfort with tech will be, but I also think there's going to be some interesting business plans out there. And there's some companies like Growers Edge who's doing some really interesting work of doing some underwriting for growers to say, hey, we want you to try this new technology. If it doesn't work, we're going to put some sort of insurance wrap on to ensure your downside is mitigated. But if you make more money, we're going to take half of it. And I think that's really interesting. You're going to give growers the opportunity to be conservative on the downside, but now see some upside. And I think that's the type of thing we're going to need to really get a movement going, because I still, even with a technology change, I still think farmers are always going to be hesitant to adopt all this technology until it's fully proven out. But if you can actually give them some confidence that their downside is protected, I think you'll see a lot more people willing to use it.
That's interesting. You just took away, if they had a little doubt, you kind of chipped away at that doubt, because now the reason they weren't going to go with something is because of ROI. I like that a lot. That'll create total new, like, people will get even more bullish on the technology they're building if they can get it to the point where someone's underwriting it.
100%. I think the one area I didn't talk about, but based on that, I probably should say some stuff. I'm really bullish on FinTech as well. I think having worked at Wells Fargo, which was the largest lender to production ag, I realized how conservative the ag banks are. And I often joke that agriculture is one of the most conservative industries, and technology and banks are some of the most conservative operators. So there's nothing like slower to do anything than an ag bank. And so I look out there and think there is a huge opportunity for innovation around finance in the ag sector. And I think you'll see more of it. We've seen some companies emerging that are doing some interesting things. But I do see that opportunity just going further and further. And by the way, the more data is out there, the easier FinTech is going to be in the ag sector, because they're going to thrive on all this information, because they're going to be able to really real time understand grower A is a good grower, but grower B is a great grower. So I should work with him. I could get better rates for him. And it's really going to segment it. The lending today into this sector, the amount of data used is very limited compared to what it should be. And I think, again, I just think data can upend how agriculture works in a very positive way and get better outcomes. And by the way, we need better outcomes. If you think about, particularly and especially in permanent, the amount of land that is either going away because it's not productive, or the growers don't want to do it anymore because it's too small to make money, we're going to have to produce more with less. We're at, I read somewhere, 30-40% of inputs of fruits and vegetables, of imports of fruits and vegetables at this point. That number is going to keep going up. And so at some point, there's going to be a question around food security. I was on with a friend yesterday talking about one of the things you don't hear a lot from Trump is about America first in food. And it's a really interesting question because unlike other products, we can't survive without food. So if we put in huge tariffs and food doesn't come in, there could be some bigger implications. But I do think over time, both for a food security and a food safety perspective, you're going to see the push to bring more food production back to the U.S. And unless we are able to significantly improve yield and performance and reduce food waste, I think we're not going to get to the point we need to be. So I think there's a huge opportunity using technology of this sort to get there.
Yeah, I would like to hear more about that too. And when these press conferences, so anyone that goes to the press conferences, when they get to ask the questions to administration, throw in some ag tech and agriculture questions in there as well. Adam, I want to thank you so much for joining me here today, and it's been just absolutely lovely hearing your take on all of this, and look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Jared, well, thank you very much. Really enjoyed the conversation as well and appreciate the invitation.